Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you can please take your seats. We'd like to be as punctual as possible. So let me thank you all for being here this morning. I'm particularly delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Japanese Embassy here in Madrid. And I would particularly like to welcome Hiroshi Yamauchi, the ambassador. Let me just say a few words about him. He's very modest and shy. And sadly, you won't see how excellent his Spanish is. But Ambassador Yamauchi has served as Japan's ambassador to Spain since last year, since November 2025. He is a graduate in law from Kyoto University. And throughout his diplomatic career, he's served in a number of places, including several Spanish-speaking posts. He has served in Peru, Mexico, and Italy. And prior to his current position here in Spain, he was Japan's ambassador to Argentina. And I have experienced for myself that he is extremely knowledgeable about Spain. He speaks excellent Spanish. He has a genuine interest in Spanish history and culture. So we are very fortunate to have him as ambassador to Spain. Ambassador, the floor is yours for a few introductory remarks.
Thank you very much for the introduction. What I have here is basically written in Spanish. I don't know if it would permit me to just give a sort of a short introductory remarks in Spanish, and maybe I'll try to sort of give maybe a resume in English. But in any case, I would just begin the part that introductory remark in Spanish. En primer lugar, quisiera agradecer a todos los que están presentes que han colaborado en la realización de este evento. Como embajador de Japón, les saludo cordialmente con el motivo del simposio de hoy. La situación internacional, como ustedes ven, actualmente se encuentra en un punto de inflexión histórico. Los avances en inteligencia artificial han multiplicado la sofisticación, velocidad y potencial disruptivo de las amenazas de seguridad en el ciberespacio. Y la manipulación e interferencia de información por países extranjeros, en siglas inglesas FIMI, el tema del simposio de hoy, tiene una influencia negativa capaz de poner en peligro nuestros valores democráticos comunes e incluso agravar, bueno, de hecho, están haciendo, pero divisiones sociales. El mundo atraviesa lo que podemos llamar una guerra de información. La urgencia y la necesidad de abordar el FIMI son más acuciantes que nunca, como pone de manifiesto nuestra situación actual. Japón, la Unión Europea y España se enfrentan a un entorno de seguridad con un grado de interconexión que no tiene precedentes históricos. 4 años después del estallido de la guerra en Ucrania, creo que tenemos una mayor conciencia de que la seguridad europea está indisolublemente ligada a la seguridad de la región de Indo-Pacífico. Para mantener y reforzar un orden internacional libre y abierto basado en los valores universales, incluyendo la democracia, Estado de Derecho y el respeto a los derechos humanos, tanto en Europa y Asia como Japón y España están llamados a profundizar bajo esta situación nuestra cooperación y coordinación más estrecha. Desde 2021, Japón y la Unión Europea han adoptado documentos estratégicos claves que orientan sus políticas de seguridad y defensa. En el contexto de la turbulenta situación internacional actual, en 2024 establecieron la Asociación Seguridad y Defensa entre Japón y la Unión Europea, y esos documentos estratégicos sustentan una sólida asociación entre Japón y la Unión Europea. De cara al futuro, se espera que la cooperación y diálogo en todos los ámbitos de seguridad y defensa se desarrollen, profundicen y se esfuercen aún más. Con respecto a la Asociación de Seguridad y Defensa entre Japón y la Unión Europea, no debemos pasar por alto el papel de Josep Borrell, investigador senior distinguido de este instituto, también antiguo alto representante de la Unión Europea para asuntos exteriores y la política de seguridad, y por supuesto antiguo ministro de Asuntos Exteriores de España. Él reconoció con prontitud la importancia de la cooperación entre Europa y Japón y desempeñó un papel destacado en el fomento de los vínculos entre Japón y Europa y entre Japón y España. Además, el pasado día 20, el gobierno español publicó su estrategia para Asia-Pacífico 2026-2029, lo que marca una nueva etapa en la cooperación bilateral dentro de la política exterior española. Ese simposio contará con una conferencia de apertura y una mesa redonda con los expertos de Asia-Europa, y a través de estos intercambios académicos esperamos que se produzcan nuevos avances en la cooperación estratégica entre Japón y la Unión Europea y entre Japón y España. Extiendo mi agradecimiento al Real Instituto Elcano por esta oportuna iniciativa y concluyo mi intervención con la esperanza de que el entendimiento mutuo entre nuestras dos naciones y regiones siga profundizándose. Bueno, muchas gracias. No, thank you very much. I hope everything was comprehensible, but I would just like to say that it's very under this situation that we encounter today, it's very important to recognize that the security in the Asian Pacific region and security in Europe is linked and inseparable, and that I think we should address the challenges that we have in front of us together. I think that was the message. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I wasn't lying when I referred to your excellent Spanish. So people have been asking us two questions. Why are we dealing with disinformation? Now, Beatriz is the expert, so I don't want to tread any toes here or invade her area of expertise. But if you look up what we are actually talking about when we talk about disinformation, a very quick definition might be that disinformation is false, inaccurate, misleading information deliberately created to deceive, manipulate, or cause harm. I think this is a nice working definition. And unlike misinformation, which may be accidental, of course, disinformation is intentional propaganda designed to influence public opinions, disrupt processes, or hide the truth. So I think any attention we might focus on this increasingly worrying phenomenon is certainly justified. And why are we doing this here in Madrid with our Japanese friends and colleagues? As the ambassador mentioned, the EU and Japan signed an agreement a couple of years ago, and the EU and Japan, I think, are natural partners in the struggle and the fight against disinformation. We are extremely like-minded. It's actually difficult to think of two entities which are more like-minded. I was referring to the EU-Japan Security and Defense Partnership. And of course, this is also part of a process whereby the European Union has been seeking like-minded partnerships all over the world in recent years. Additionally, I want to emphasize how complementary Spain and Japan specifically are. It's not just complementarity between Japan and the EU, it's also specifically Spain and Japan. As we were discussing last night, Ambassador, opinion polls show that actually our societies share very similar worldviews. They are both strongly supportive of multilateral institutions and international law. They are both mature, advanced, democratic societies. And let me add, some of you know why I will say this, that they happen to be parliamentary monarchies. And let me just say that 8 out of the world's most advanced democracies with populations of more than 1 million people are, curiously, monarchies: Belgium, Denmark, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. And I think this is relevant because, after all, what we're going to be talking about here today is democracy and its enemies. And disinformation, of course, has become a major source of concern in this context, a concern which has been deepened and accelerated by the artificial intelligence boom, which I'm sure we will be talking about this morning. The ambassador also briefly mentioned the sources of disinformation. A major source, of course, is Russia. I have no qualms about naming and shaming, let me warn you. And of course, the incredibly heroic Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression, which was totally unjustified and inadmissible, has generated a new wave of Russian disinformation. China, of course, with its vast technological resources, is also a very serious concern, and that, of course, is why the European Union describes China as a systemic rival. But we assume, and I think this is widely shared, that China does not, in fact, have a similar worldview to ours, and it's one which isn't always compatible. And sadly, of course, there is most recently a third source of disinformation, namely the Trump administration, which is generating disinformation, I would say, on an unprecedented scale. So we have these three, obviously very different types of disinformation, but they are all equally worrying to my mind, precisely because they can have an enormous impact on our domestic politics and our domestic public opinions. And the reason why we're doing this in an EU perspective is because the EU, which is much maligned in some quarters, but I think we should always remember how important the EU is in this as in many other aspects. The EU is actually better positioned, better placed than probably any other institution that Spain belongs to, at least, in order to deal with this challenge, because this is ultimately a whole-of-society challenge. It has military dimensions, it has cyber dimension, it has industrial dimensions, and of course it threatens the stability and continuity of our democratic systems of government. And that is why we have a very interesting speaker here who's going to kick off this session with a keynote speech. Beatriz Marín García is a data analyst in the Information Integrity and Countering Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Division. I think she should get a prize simply for the length of that title. And this is a division which exists within the European External Action Service. She leads digital investigations and develops strategies for detecting and responding to FIMI. And prior to being such a prominent member of the External Action Service, she has worked in DG Communication and DG Connect in the European Commission. So she's had a foot in the Commission world and now works for the External Action Service. She is a sociologist and an expert in communications, and we are very fortunate to have her with us today. Beatriz, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Ambassador, Mr. Powell. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm always happy to come back home, to come back to Madrid. Let me start by thanking the Royal Institute Elcano for the invitation, in particular to Félix Arteaga, Ángel Vadillo, Mario Esteban, and Cristina de Esperanza. I must admit that I will begin my remarks on a negative tone. Unfortunately, the daily news leaves us with the limited room for optimism these days. But rather than leaving us pessimistic, I hope this serves as a call for action, a reminder that challenges we face today require stronger cooperation, greater awareness, and renewed commitment. We are living in a complex and increasingly turbulent times where the weaponization of the information environment is becoming an increasingly normalized practice. Information manipulation is used as a part of a broader hybrid arsenal that combines digital interference with physical attacks and also coercive actions aimed at destabilizing societies and undermining political opponents. The global security environment has clearly deteriorated. Armed conflicts close to the borders of the European Union have not only persisted, but in many cases increased and escalated. incidents involving drones and other incursions into EU territory have further contributed to a climate of intimidation and uncertainty. In this context, the information space has become a central arena of geopolitical competition. Narratives are deliberately shaped, amplified, and manipulated in order to influence public debates, weaken trust in democratic institutions, and ultimately affect political decision-making. For more than 11 years, the European External Action Service, together with member states and other international partners, has been at the forefront of efforts to understand and counter foreign information manipulation and interference, or FIMI. And this this is the first step in this effort that it's clearly defined the nature of the threat. In order to address the problem effectively, we must first be able to name it and to describe it in a common language, with this objective, the EAS developed and defined the concept of FIMI, which represents an evolution beyond the term disinformation. While disinformation focuses primarily on the content, on whether information is false or misleading, the concept of FIMI shifts the focus to who is behind the manipulation and how it is conducted. In other words, we are not analyzing, or we are not just analyzing false narratives, we are identifying the foreign actors who orchestrate and promote these campaigns, as well as understanding the manipulative tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, that are used to create, distort, publish, and amplify content. Once the scope of the problem became clear, the European Union began developing a set of tools to respond to this challenge. And this is what we call the FIMI toolbox, our catalog of responses. The FIMI toolbox brings together different instruments that the EU has developed to counter this threat. It builds on four key pillars. The first one is improving situational awareness. The second one is strengthening societal resilience. The third, developing regulatory frameworks that protect the integrity of the information environment. And the fourth, reinforcing the EU's external action in close cooperation with member states and international partners, such as Japan. Partnerships are essentials in this effort. Cooperation with like-minded partners, including Japan, plays a crucial role in shaping and having a shared understanding of the threat, and in developing collective responses to FIMI. The European External Action Service monitors the information space on a daily basis in order to detect and analyze cases of FIMI, particularly those linked to actors such as Russia and China. And in 2 weeks, we will publish the fourth annual report on FIMI threats, which provides what we believe is the most comprehensive assessment of FIMI activities worldwide. Although we just cover a limited scope, so the threat it's always bigger than what we are able to capture and observe. And I would like to take this opportunity today to offer a brief preview of some of the findings of the upcoming report. In 2025, FIMI activity reached a new level of operational complexity and global reach. Attacks increased not only in frequency, but also in intensity and sophistication. Over the course of the year, the EAS detected 540 incidents globally. One important finding is that FIMI campaigns rarely respect geographic boundaries. The networks targeting one region often appear in another region. And in terms of numbers, last year, FIMI incidents affected and attempt to destabilize all regions of the world, with more than 100 countries targeted. As previous years, according to our analysis, Ukraine remained the primary target. And notably, Japan also appears among the 15 countries more frequently targeted by FIMI incidents from foreign actors. Another remark concerns the increasing technological dimension of these operations. On one hand, structural challenges linked to the governance of global digital platforms and their role in shaping the information flows continue to create vulnerabilities within the information ecosystem. And on the other hand, artificial intelligence is increasingly used in FIMI operations. AI-generated text, synthetic video, also manipulated audios, have moved from an experimental use to be part of the routine, becoming scalable and cost-effective tools for threat actors. In 2025, 25% of the incidents detected by the EAS involved the use of AI tools to produce and distribute content. And finally, FIMI campaigns are increasingly targeting institutions and organizations that play a central role in democratic societies. Around 200 different organizations were targeted last year, including political and security institutions, but also media outlets. These attacks are designed not only to spread specific narratives, but also to undermine trust in the information environment itself, helping to increase the information disorder in the global information space. An increasingly observed pattern in recent years is that many influence operations are designed to maintain what we call plausible deniability. That means that rather than acting directly, threat actors rely more and more on covert intermediaries and proxy networks that obscure the role of the state behind the campaign and complicate the attribution. For this reason, FIMI should not be understood simply as a communication problem. Instead, we need to describe it as a structured system, as a business, and a supply chain model. At its foundations, there are threat actors who design the strategy and provide resources. Above them operate layers of intermediaries, of contractors, who translate this strategic intent into concrete FIMI operations. To do it, they rely on fabricated digital infrastructures with coordinated networks of channels and websites that produce, adapt, and amplify content across different platforms. This architecture, therefore, functions as a vertical system where each layer is interconnected. And what we observe at the surface, the narratives, the posts, the viral content, is only the visible outcome of a much deeper organizational structure. Understanding this structure is crucial. By identifying the vulnerabilities and the enabling mechanisms that sustain FIMI activities or FIMI operations, we gain new opportunities to act. Rather than responding only to individual narratives, we can also target the critical points of the FIMI system itself. And I will use a comparison with judo. Victory rarely comes from brute force. It comes from understanding the opponent's balance and using their own momentum against them. The same principle can be applied to FIMI. By understanding how these systems operate, we can identify where and how to tackle them more effectively. Democratic institutions across the European Union, together with other like-minded partners, already possess a range of instruments to address FIMI. We have legal, diplomatic, economic, and technical tools that provide a solid foundation to confront this threat. And yet, too often, hostile actions in the information space still occur without meaningful consequences. Recognizing this challenge, on the 12th of November last year, the European Commission and the High Representative Kaja Kallas announced the European Democracy Shield, a new EU strategy aimed at safeguarding the integrity of the information space and strengthening societal resilience against disinformation. In a context where these threats are escalating in scale and sophistication, the European Union must also scale its response. For this reason, and in complementarity with the Democracy Shield, the next step for the European External Action Service is to act as the operational sword, translating analysis and coordination into responses with tangible impact. Rather than remaining predominantly reactive to incidents on the terms set by perpetrators, our focus must shift from reaction to anticipation. This operational sword is built around three key pillars. The first one is faster collective attribution and responses, enabled by better data, stronger analytical capabilities, and improved operational coordination among partners. The second pillar is scaling up our capabilities within the EU, but also with international partners, strengthening joint cooperation so that we can respond effectively across regions and domains, not just the FIMI domain. And the third pillar is increasing the impact of our countermeasures. This is a key element, ensuring that those who conduct FIMI face real and visible consequences. I will finish my intervention by talking about the EU-Japan cooperation. When discussing FIMI, according to recent investigations, Japan offers a particularly interesting case. For many years, there was a widespread perception that Japan was relatively isolated from these threats. A combination of high societal trust, a stable media environment, and the complexity of the Japanese language created the impression that foreign influence operation would struggle to gain traction. However, this perception has gradually changed, and Japan, like other democracies, is increasingly exposed to manipulation in the information space, moving the issue of information manipulation from the angle of public communication into the domain of security policy. And this is precisely where cooperation between the EU and Japan becomes particularly important. Within the EU-Japan Security and Defense Partnership adopted in Tokyo in 2024, the EU and Japan have already identified several areas for cooperation, specifically related to hybrid threats and FIMI. And these include strengthening dialogue on the evolving threat landscape and sharing best practices in responding to foreign influence operations. And another element of this cooperation lies in research and knowledge exchange. The partnership encourages closer collaboration between academic institutions, think tanks, and research centers working on hybrid threats and strategic communications. And like the event that we are celebrating today, cooperation between the European Union and Japan is not only about addressing individual incidents of disinformation or influence operations, it's about building a broader partnership aimed at strengthening the resilience of our democratic information environments in an increasingly contested global landscape. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you productive and stimulating discussion today.
Thank you very much, Beatriz, for that very useful overview. I hope the ambassador appreciated the judo metaphor, which I think was rather good. And I'm going to hand over to Mario Esteban, and we will leave the table.
Let's begin now with a round table, this second panel for this event. Thank you very much to all of you for being here today, and particularly to our panelists, our speakers, and of course to Professor Aoi in particular for coming directly from Japan for this event. I'm supposed to introduce the topic, before presenting the panelists, but frankly speaking, I think that the topic has been introduced, quite enough, with the previous speakers, with particular, by Beatriz, So I will skip that part, but I would just like to underline, one idea that was put on the table before, that we are talking about a whole of society issue, and that's part of the reason, as we will see later, that we have a diverse, panel here. We have representative from the administration, from the civil society, from academia, So in order to provide this more nuanced and more multidimensional, perspective on this very complex topic. Our first panelist is Professor Aoi, and she is the She's a professor of international security at the Graduate School of Public Policy, where she directs, the Strategic Communications Education and Research Unit. And as you can imagine, that's the reason, she is here today, and she is one of the most well-known experts on Japan on this topic. She is also a member of the additional editorial board of Defense Strategic Communications, which is the official journal of NATO Strategic Communications. And previously, she served on the Council on Security and Defense Capabilities, appointed, by in the Shinzo Abe cabinet. She is going to provide, much more detail on the perspective on Japan of this issue. That's it. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mario, for your very kind introduction, and I very much thank Elcano for very kind invitation extended, also the Embassy of Japan in Spain for enabling such an important event. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I also would like to thank support provided ESIWA, Enhancing Security in and with Asia program of the European Union, for the support provided to my unit in the past 4 years, indeed. Thank you very much. Today, my talk focuses on one central question: can Japan and Europe work together effectively against foreign information manipulation and interference, what the EU calls FIMI? And I have to state that what I mention as of now is my academic opinion without representing any of the agencies that I work with, including EU and NATO circumciary. Both sides, both Europe and Japan, are liberal democracies whose security and prosperity depend upon open rules-based order. Yet they sit in different strategic environments, even if they share important interests, and they have developed different vocabularies, institutions, and cultures around information threats. My argument is that cooperation is both necessary and possible, but it will be most productive if it is grounded in shared analysis of one another's strategic environments and priorities, national predicaments, and specific threat landscapes, and if it focuses on narrative alignment rather than attempting to fully harmonize operational responses to FIMI or disinformation. Let me start with a brief conceptual clarification. In recent years, FIMI has become a core term in European debates. As the previous speaker very elaborately explained, it refers to mostly non-illegal, intentional and coordinated manipulative behavior by state or non-state actors that threatens or harms the values and political processes. Disinformation, on the other hand, focuses on false and misleading content that is spread deliberately to deceive. It is one possible tool within FIMI, but FIMI is about broader campaign, and it focuses on actors' behaviors and tactics, not just individual falsehoods. To my mind, both FIMI and disinformation are forms of subversion, efforts to undermine democratic values, political discourse, and institutions. They are often expressed through specific tactics and campaigns in the information environment. Japan officially does not use the term FIMI. It tends to speak of disinformation and more recently of information warfare in the cognitive domain. At the same time, Japan has a much longer tradition of strategic communications than it has of counter-disinformation. For over a quarter of a century, strategic communications has been central to how Japan imagines and shapes its regional and global environment, especially through the Indo-Pacific, and now the free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. What do I mean by strategic communications in this context? Strategic communications is a long-term shaping of dominant discourses in society. According to NATO COE, it is a holistic approach to communication based on values and interests that encompasses everything an actor does to achieve objectives in a contested environment. It is not messaging, nor is it reactive rebuttal. Rather, it projects a long-term vision over decades as a matter of policy, shaping discourse in an anticipatory manner and seeking to shape proactively the information space with a compelling, coherent story of one's own. In that sense, Japan's Indo-Pacific vision and FOIP are themselves strategic communications in action. They construct the Indo-Pacific not as a physical geographical space, but as a political space where the rule of law, freedom of navigation, open and fair trade, and connectivity are the organizing principles. Through this vision, Japan has expanded its relations with Quad partners, namely with India, Australia, and the United States, as well as with ASEAN and Europe, and it has framed an inclusive rules-based international order. Hence, the Indo-Pacific is not about containing China, but about creating proactively an environment in which the rule of law, transparency, and other key composite principles are respected. FOIP is therefore geopolitical practice and strategic communications at the same time. Against this backdrop, how does FIMI appear from Tokyo? Japan's strategic value as a target for information manipulation is quite high. It is a key US ally in East Asia, a G7 member, and a central anchor in the US-led security architecture that many authoritarian actors have an interest in weakening. For a long time, Japan's information space was seen as relatively insular and resilient. Language, media structures, and political culture all seem to offer some protection. However, there are legitimate predictions that this insulation may erode in the coming decade. Japanese society is becoming more segmented along socioeconomic and other lines. Social media penetration is deepening, and foreign instigated narratives in Japanese are increasingly visible. Recent open source intelligence studies show how Russian and Chinese information operations are present in the Japanese language information space and sometimes interact with each other. A recently published OSINT study that I co-authored with an expert OSINT team at Cardiff University in the UK found that Russian and Chinese campaigns differ in themes and style and are still largely uncoordinated, but they nevertheless converge in their strategic purpose to produce net information effect. Russian state media and affiliated accounts portray Japan as a pawn of the West, question the value of US-Japan alliance, attack Japan's reputation as a democratic rules-based actor, and reframe the Ukraine war and nuclear risks in ways that undercut criticism of Russian aggression. Chinese narratives, by contrast, often reframe FOIP itself as a US-led containment strategy, emphasize a Chinese constructive role through Belt and Road Initiative and economic cooperation with the Global South, and exploit specific controversies, such as Fukushima treated water issue, to cast doubt on Japan's trustworthiness. The important point, however, is that the mere presence of these narratives does not automatically equate to impact. We see activity. We do not always know how far it changes attitudes and policy behavior. Yet policy debates often conflate presence with effect. How has Japan responded so far? First, by re-emphasizing and doubling down on strategic communications and FOIP. Diplomatically, Japan consistently frames itself as an inclusive maritime democracy that respects international law, committed to open sea lanes, connectivity, and capacity building. STRATCOM is essentially anticipatory. Instead of chasing every individual hostile narrative, Japan tries to articulate a clear, long-term story about what it stands for and the kind of order it seeks in the region and beyond. That story itself becomes a shield against manipulation. Second, Japan is investing in analytical capabilities to monitor information operations. Policymakers and industry-based researchers are using social media monitoring, network analysis, and content analysis to map concrete foreign campaigns rather than speaking only in generalities about fake news. Third, Japan has strengthened the whole of government machinery to identifying information by elevating the focal point of such analysis and considerations to the level of Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. But there are constraints. Attribution and public attribution is politically sensitive. Publicly naming specific foreign state-linked actors requires high evidentiary standards and willingness to absorb potential diplomatic and other costs. Japan, to date, has tended to handle cases in context of existing bilateral and diplomatic relations rather than through high-profile public exposure or public attribution of the sources. What does all this mean for Japan-Europe cooperation? On the one hand, The case for cooperation is strong. Japan and Europe share an interest in preserving an open, rules-based order and stable information environments. Their respective Indo-Pacific strategies already overlap substantially. Authoritarian actors increasingly combine information manipulation with economic pressure and military coercion. Fragmented, siloed responses will not be sufficient. On the other hand, there are real constraints we need to recognize honestly. Europe's immediate security focus is Russia and war in Ukraine. For many European governments, FIMI is perceived as an existential threat on their own borders. Japan also supports Ukraine and works closely with Europe and NATO, and as well as G7, but its primary strategic challenge lies with China and with a broader balance of power and economic interdependence in the Indo-Pacific. That shapes how much political attention and resources can be devoted specifically to FIMI, and responses will be embedded in those existing bilateral, multilateral relations. There are also differences in responses to US predictability. Many European leaders speak of strategic autonomy, including in defense and information resilience. Japan, whose deterrence posture is closely tied to the United States, has much less room for overt strategic distancing, even as it builds unilateral mechanisms like the Quad and diversify supply chains. Finally, there are technical and cultural differences. Several European actors now have robust FIMI monitoring structures, early warning mechanisms, and culture of visible public attribution. Japan's information collection is more discrete, more compartmentalized, and formal channels for translating analytical findings into public-facing policy are still under development. These differences do not make cooperation impossible, but they do shape what kind of cooperation is realistic. So what is both realistic and valuable? I would highlight three areas. First, coordinated narratives. Japan and Europe can work together to tell a coherent long-term story about the rules-based order, what it means in practice, why it is not a great power monopoly, and how it benefits smaller and middle powers. This is especially important in the Indo-Pacific, where competing visions of order vying for attention. Second, share the analytical standards and methods. Joint research, academic policy networks, and regular exchanges of analytical practice can help align how we identify and evaluate FIMI. In particular, we need better ways to distinguish between the presence of manipulation and its impact, and to develop agreed threshold for when a campaign merits policy responses. Third, coordinated support to third countries. Both Japan and Europe are major providers of development assistance and capacity building. They already run programs for independent media, election management, and governance in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Aligning some of those efforts, sharing analysis, coordinating training, co-funding projects could meaningfully strengthen the information resilience of partners of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the wider region. I end here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Aoi, for this very comprehensive view. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague at the Elcano Royal Institute, Felix Arteaga, where he is a senior analyst focused on defense policy and international security issues. He's a former serviceman, and he has also worked as senior analyst at the International Affairs and Foreign Policy Institute and at the Duque de Ahumada and Internal Security Institutes of the Guardia Civil. He holds a PhD in international relations and a degree in political science from the Complutense University of Madrid, and he's going to provide also a perspective from academia or the analyst perspective, in this case from the Spanish side. Felix?
Good morning, everyone. The organizer asked me to make some kind of comparison between European Union, Japan, and Spanish policies, strategies, and structures. But before, I like to make a couple of comments. First, disinformation is something more than FIMI, something more than foreign campaigns. It's a challenge that is affecting not only to government, but also to the societies and individuals. In this regard, I see that this is a newcomer to the international security field, disinformation. We are just in the learning curve. And of course, every actor is in a different level. And I see here the European Union in a higher level than Spain and Japan entering in the process. But it will take some time before we can understand this comprehensive security and new challenge for our society. So we are learning by doing, we are doing our best, but we don't have the disinformation challenge under control. One said that how these three actors frame this, the answer to the challenge. Well, in the case of the European Union, as Beatriz said, the focus is on the democratic integrity and systemic risks for the information ecosystem all across Europe. Now, the focus is on protecting elections and public debate. I say this is a more global approach than the one coming from national member states. Spain entered in the answer and the same feeling. We have democratic challenge we have with the information ecosystem, but also we have internal risks and foreign campaigns, and that is something that made our government to develop structures. Spain, as most of the European Union state members, frame the answer within the national security strategies. The same is in the case of Japan. Perhaps still is more disinformation more considered under the information warfare approach. If disinformation has more to do with defense, national security, and hybrid warfare. This is how they elaborated the different strategies. Russia is the principal threat for the European Union, and China is coming behind. For Spain, Russia, and for internal reason and for evidences we have witnessed in our national security. And of course, not only this, but also because of our internal problems of polarization and distrust between societies and political parties, we are now trying to see how do we respond to these internal threats about this information. In the case of Japan, as I said, China, Russia, and North Korea, and probably more. Well, the European Union is focused on regulatory governance of the digital ecosystem. Spain follows the European Union in that regard, the Digital Service Act and other European Union multilateral frameworks. But Spain is developing also national mechanism for coordination, not regulatory so far, but in the future we could witness a new kind of preventive regulatory mechanism of the disinformation landscape. For the Japan, the core policy is focused on geopolitical competition. This is important because the geopolitical competition introduced economic areas, new technological and areas for energy and sustainability problems for disinformation. And this is, I see, a broader approach, not only national security, but geopolitical competition. The European Union is highly institutionalized. The European Union has created strategic communication within the European External Action Service, the European strategic communication, rapid eye systems, digital media observatory, and many other structures specialized and focused on disinformation. And the European Union member states are taking advantage of that development, and we follow them and we complement, but not substitute what they are elaborating. Of course, in the case of Spain, we have created a National Security Department for the disinformation, and we have increased the intergovernmental coordination with a permanent, and this is something different from Japan, we have a permanent interagency, intersectorial cooperation commission, which is supervising what is going on disinformation. We have less structural development than the European Union, but I believe, that's my opinion, than Japan. Legal and regulatory tools, as I said here, in this field, the European Union is the reference for all European Union member states, and they have the Digital Service Act, Code of Practice, and well, the member states must follow and apply. The problem for European Union member states, not about regulation, but about implementation, which is very difficult for the European Union or structures to reinforce or to enforce. And in the case of Japan, the regulatory tools are still limited because I see, it's my bias, could be, that they are in an early stage of development. But the time will bring them. About public-private cooperation, this is something very important because the European Union, and because of the need for protecting the election, the democratic institution, and so forth, they have opened the institutions to cooperation with private sectors, coming not only from the academia, but also from private actor stakeholders like the fact-checkers, communities, which is a real active asset in the European Union hand. The European Union is acting on the European and non-European platforms. Laws are binding for them, and all regulation that the European Union promote is supporting the strategies and policies on disinformation of the European countries. But the European Union is doing much more. It's trying to force the intellectual, conceptual, and operational understanding of disinformation. That's why they have created a system of grants, putting money, and the network of observatories. In the regard, the case of our institute, we joined the European network of observatories to understand, together with our Portuguese colleagues, what happened in Spain and Portugal about disinformation. I will still remain there thanks to the support of the European Union institution. And in this way, the academia, in the large sense, the think tanks, fact-checkers in Spain, they have a very wide window of opportunity to cooperate with the institutions. In the case of Japan, and I could be wrong on that judgment, there is, of course, cooperation with fact-checkers, academia, but on very occasional ways, not in a permanent and systematized manner. About operations, the European Union, detection, attribution. In the case of FIMI, not with translation into military operation, nor but just about diplomatic operation. In the case of Spain, the operation is focused on foreign campaigns. What the foreign actors, Russia and China, say about Spain, the economy of Spain, the government of Spain, and so forth. In my opinion, this answer, this operational focus, is still lacking of a diplomatic sector and a military sector. In the case of Japan, for instance, disinformation is framed within the military planning system, and this is something that, in my opinion, I could be wrong, is still missing in Spain. We should have, in my opinion, to increase the relevance of disinformation within the diplomat and military and intelligence service operations. The level of politicization here, moderate to high within the European member states. Disinformation is a general level link to the democratic debate, no? What our media could say and not, how to control respectable media new actors. In the case of Spain, we have one of the highest politicization levels. Domestic political contestation over everything we could do on disinformation. The so-called Ministry of Truth is a joke, but it reflects very well how do we see this need. On the one hand, we need to cope with disinformation, but on the other hand, we distrust the instruments, the tools that our government try to apply. In the case of Japan, the level of politicization, of course, is lower. The consensus, the level of consensus between political party, the elites, and on foreign threats is higher. So this is something to be taken into account, because the public opinion in some cases perceive an external disinformation source of the threat, and in other cases what they perceive as an internal disinformation source. So we have to deal with this. The main, I like to conclude, I want to abuse of your time. We have in Spain, for instance, a rule-based system aligned with the European Union governance model and permanent interministerial interagency structures. In the case of Japan, they have a national security-oriented system coordinated by the executive and still evolving toward more comprehensive model to include private sectors and sectors. Both, of course, all of them, the European Union, Japan, and Spain, they are concerned about strategic threats that affect the democratic resilience and security, and are try to look for rapid detection and coordination response. But there are differences between us. They deal with the level of legal codification. Codification requires time, and we are just beginning to understand the problem. The degree of supranational integration, in the case of Spain, is well integrated into the European Union, but we have to improve our cooperation with other actors in the international field, with other institutions and countries. And of course, they differ in the role of private actors, the different stakeholders in the system. So I would like to stay here and give more room to other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felix, in particular for this, for triggering this debate between, putting more emphasis on this debate, comparison between EU, Spain, and Japan, and I'm sure that we will go deeper on that in the Q&A. Let's move now to our next speaker. He's Guillermo Lopez. He is the Deputy Director for the Promotion of Spanish Abroad at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. His unit implements Spain's international policy for the promotion of the Spanish language, including initiatives to strengthen Spanish in science and supports the development of Spanish-trained artificial intelligence. It addresses also disinformation, and that's the reason, of course, he's here with us today. And I would like also to mention that his first, if I'm not mistaken, your first work experience with disinformation actually was in Latvia, before this position. Maybe you can also refer to that. So Guillermo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And good morning to all of you. I will address how governments are confronting one of the most persistent threats to democratic societies these days, disinformation. I have tried to follow the guidelines provided by our hosts. My apologies if I am somewhat repetitive. I'll try my best. While disinformation is a new phenomenon, the digital revolution has transformed, as has been mentioned, its scale, its speed, and its capacity to influence public opinion to unprecedented levels. I'll focus specifically, as requested, on Spain's governmental approach, its plans, guidelines, and concrete actions, focusing especially on the challenges involved in the use of a global language spoken by some 635 million people globally. This is why I have been invited here. It may have seemed somewhat counterintuitive after the presentation, but there's a reason, there's a connection here that I will hope to help you find. Where possible, I'll also try to draw comparisons with Japan's perspective. However, I must acknowledge upfront that while Spanish documentation is extensive, information on Japan's specific governmental framework is limited in the available materials, which makes Professor Aoi's intervention today all the more timely and interesting. I have divided my presentation into 4 parts, followed by a conclusion. First, I will deal with Spain's strategic framework. Some of what I am about to say has already been sketched out. Spain has indeed positioned disinformation as a core national security concern. I will outline 3 key strategic documents that frame Spain's government's response. Number 1 is the 2021 National Security Strategy, which explicitly states that the main update in the risk map is the inclusion of disinformation campaigns. The document further recognizes the cognitive domain as a new space for exercising influence alongside traditional physical domains such as land, sea, and air. Critically, it identifies 3 inherent elements of disinformation campaigns. Number 1, the intent to generate confusion and undermine social cohesion. Number 2, the coordinated use of different media to create and disseminate content targeting broad audiences. And number 3, the malicious intention to discredit or influence attack targets. The strategy particularly warns about foreign actors, both state and non-state, developing propaganda apparatuses to polarize society and undermine institutional confidence. It emphasizes that combating disinformation requires systematic detection, early warning, notification, and coordinated response, always aligned with European Union frameworks. The second document is the External Action Strategy for 2025-2028. that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation released, recognizing that in a climate of polarization marked by rising disinformation, Spain must champion open and inclusive societies. There's a key commitment in the strategy, strengthening international cooperation to prevent and combat disinformation is an unavoidable priority. The strategy also highlights a crucial dimension, the linguistic responsibility. It states, Spanish-speaking countries share responsibility for preventing and combating this threat, so Spain will continue promoting new bilateral and multilateral cooperation mechanisms for this purpose. The linguistic approach, developed by the General Directorate under which I work, is a distinctive Spanish contribution to this debate, recognizing that traditional geographic frameworks are insufficient when dealing with global languages like Spanish. And incidentally, if we look at the European Union, we have very many other global languages. We have French, German, Portuguese, Italian. This is indeed an obstacle that Japan faces, I understand, to a lesser degree. I hope it will therefore be interesting to our Japanese colleagues. And the third key document is the annual National Security Report for 2024, which is produced by the Department of National Security that has been mentioned before. This report characterizes FIMI threats from the Spanish government's perspective. Some key findings to understand and key to understanding said government's perspective are Russia's opportunistic campaigns. The Kremlin continues targeting Spain, Europe and the West, manipulating support for Ukraine to question Spain's EU and NATO membership. Then there's the exploitation of national crises, events like pandemics, electoral processes, or natural disasters are weaponized to erode democratic legitimacy, as seen in October 2024 during the Dana floods in Valencia. And finally, the geographic targeting. Russia prioritizes disinformation operations specifically toward Africa, Latin America and Asia to counter Western influence. I will move on to Spain's distinctive approach. Just mentioned the linguistic dimension. This particularly innovative approach is the linguistic framework, a concept that I will detail to the best of my abilities. Firstly, this arises from the insufficiency of geographic approaches that traditional counter-disinformation efforts have followed. They have focused on what happens within borders. However, Spain recognizes that major global languages create worldwide communication spaces where citizens share media and social platforms regardless of frontiers. And this is a framework that we have to keep in mind when dealing with FIMI. The numbers in our case tell the story. There are over 635 million Spanish speakers across 4 continents, of which only about 48 are in Spain. There are 520 million native speakers. Spain represents Spanish language, not Spain as a target. Spanish language represents 5% of identified Russian FIMI operations. But this 5% reaches populations in NATO territory, including Spain and Hispanic communities in the United States, and also NATO strategic partners such as Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. Secondly, there's what I have called the communicative flanking threat. While European attention, that has been mentioned by our Japanese colleague, concentrates on operations against Ukraine and the Baltics, hostile actors built an influence architecture in Spanish language, reaching 3 distinct strategic geographic spaces: Latin America, the US Hispanic community, which is about 68 million people of Hispanic origin, making up for 20% of the US population, and 44.9 million of those speak Spanish at home. The figures are rather sketchy. You may keep in mind that a lot of these speakers are undocumented immigrants, and the figures may be fuzzy, but it is a large number. That's what I would like you to keep in mind. And finally, Spain itself, often serving as a bridge between Europe and America. This multi-geographic deployment in a single linguistic space allows hostile actors to break Atlantic consensus on key issues like Ukraine support, but there are obviously others. We are seeing the examples these days, eroding and risking alliance cohesion from within through locally adapted but centrally coordinated narratives. This is a field of specialty for Ms. Jimenez here. I hope she'll broach this. Thirdly, there are Spain's planned actions. Firstly, within Ibero-American cooperation, the 2026 summit in Madrid has identified disinformation and the combat of it as a priority area. Spain aims to promote new mechanisms for cooperations to enhance fluid exchange of information, to develop operational cooperation for early warning through network activation, and finally to create reaction tools, including national rapid reaction teams, as mentioned by the keynote speaker. Secondly, there's European integration, which has been mentioned, so I'll try and be brief. Spain plays an active role in the EU initiatives that have been mentioned, such as the European Democracy Shield, the European Centre for Democratic Resilience, which is an intelligence-focused body designed to combat disinformation campaigns by coordinating voluntarily the intelligence provided by member states' security services. And finally, the implementation of two key documents, the Digital Services Act and the AI Act. In addition, international cooperation is the central pillar of these efforts. I will skip this bit regarding the EU-Japan summit held in Tokyo, as it has been approached rather splendidly before by the ambassador, among others. And I shall move on to strategic communication and social defense. Spain recognizes that effective responses to FIMI threats require using all elements of national power, be they economic, diplomatic, discursive, cognitive, military, cyber, cultural, or technological. The government also emphasizes detection and early warning systems, public-private cooperation with platforms, media literacy initiatives, coordination with fact-checking organizations, again, such as Maldita, but also Neutral or F Verifica. And finally, the Spanish MFA recently launched a public tender for FIMI campaign monitoring, which has been awarded to Spanish company True Flag. Among its functions, the company will carry out daily monitoring of social media accounts and websites in order to identify potential narratives affecting the image of the ministry in the areas of Spain's foreign policy. Finally, a comparison with Japan, and again, I must acknowledge a significant limitation. Comprehensive information is simply not available in the documentation that I have had access to. However, we can identify some potential areas for comparison. Professor Oy provided areas for cooperation as well, which were rather interesting, based on strategic context. First, there are similarities. Both Spain and Japan are democratic allies facing hybrid threats. They both have strategic interests in regional stability. It's Asia-Pacific for Japan. It's Latin America for us. They both face disinformation operations from authoritarian states, and they both participate in multilateral frameworks. I will be glad to hear. We have heard extensively about the EU in in Spain. I would like to hear more about the Quad arrangements for Japan. But there are differences. Spain has some advantages over Japan, such as being embedded in EU collective response mechanisms. Again, the document signed in 2024-2025 goes some way toward alleviating that problem. There's a linguistic reach through the Spanish-speaking world. Obviously, this is also a challenge. And there's finally a formal NATO framework for the hybrid threat response. Japan has a unique context, having a different linguistic ecosystem. Japanese language is way more geographically concentrated. The Asia-Pacific regional dynamics are different. There are distinct constitutional constraints on security matters, I understand. And again, and finally, there are specific threats from regional actors. And finally, there's a research gap with which I and we in Spain, I believe, are faced, such as legislative frameworks, institutional mechanisms, regional cooperation initiatives, and public-private partnerships with Japanese tech companies. I have tried to be brief. I come to my conclusion either way. Spain's governmental approach to disinformation demonstrates several distinctive features: high-level strategic recognition, linguistic innovation, multi-level coordination, and a comprehensive response combining diplomatic, technological, educational, and intelligence tools. The Spanish case illustrates that effective government response requires recognizing the specific vulnerabilities of each democratic society. For Spain, the Spanish language is simultaneously a strength and one such vulnerability, connecting over 600 million people, but also creating rather exploitable attack surfaces. While a systematic comparison with Japan requires additional documentation, the Spanish experience hopefully offers valuable lessons. Governments must develop context-specific responses that account for linguistic, cultural, and geopolitical particularities while maintaining strong international cooperation. The challenge ahead is ensuring these governmental frameworks remain adaptive, proportionate, and respectful of democratic freedoms while effectively countering an evolving threat landscape. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Guillermo, for this very detailed presentation on the posture and measures taken by the Spanish government on this issue. And let's move now to our last panelist, Clara Jimenez. And well, she's a practitioner. She's a journalist. I mean, she is the co-founder of Maldita.es. That is a global nonprofit dedicated to countering disinformation and strengthening democratic resilience. She's also the president of the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. Well, she works regularly as university lecturer, public speaker, on these issues, like she's here today. Well, I'm very eager, actually, to hear your thoughts, from day-to-day, everyday experience, on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I think the approach that I'm going to give to the problem of disinformation is quite different from the one that has been given up to now, also because I think we're looking at disinformation from a defense perspective and only from a foreign interference perspective. And I think we need to acknowledge that disinformation is part of the world we live in, not only as governments or as countries, but also as citizens. And hence, the approach towards disinformation also needs to come from civil society and engage in civil society in order to better fight against it. And understanding that not everything is FIMI and that DIMI, domestic information manipulation and interference, also exists, and in countries like Spain is extremely prominent and extremely coordinated with FIMI efforts as well. But we'll get there. I'm also the only one that is going to use a presentation, so that was in... Thank you. Those in the back, you have monitors on the sides. So I want to talk about the fact-checking environment. It is not the only kind of CSO that is working towards information integrity, but fact-checkers around the world have been one of the most prominent actors within civil society in trying to fight disinformation, and I'm going to focus on fact-checking because that's actually what I know about. I want to talk about how fact-checkers in Japan and Spain are different, and the maturity of the fact-checking ecosystem is quite different. I'd like to talk about fact-checking around the world and the challenges it's facing currently and has faced over time anyways. I'd like to talk about the regional initiatives around fact-checking because I think that specifically in Europe, the EFCSN is extremely important in the way that fact-checking organizations have developed, but also because there are regional initiatives in Asia-Pacific, and I think it's worth mentioning them as well. And I want to talk about the relationship with legislators within the EU, because that poses some questions when being civil society dedicated to fact-checking that has to be independent, non-partisan, and has to be perceived by the public like that as well to be efficient. And lastly, I will give you some conclusions of things that haven't been directly mentioned here and that I think are worth taking into account when we talk about disinformation. So first of all, state of fact-checking, Japan versus Spain. Many here will know about the Spanish fact-checking ecosystem. In general, Spanish fact-checkers come from media and journalistic environments. There are non-profit, for-profit companies, both of them. There are also national agencies that have gone into fact-checking, like Agencia F. The ecosystem is quite broad. There are at least 5 fact-checkers in a country of 40, or almost 50, right? Million people right now. And also the maturity of the ecosystem is quite significant in comparison with other countries, even within Europe. So fact-checkers in Spain are tech-savvy, they're well-developed, they have business models. We're among the biggest, not only in the country, but in the continent and in the world. Just to give you an example of this, Fundación Maldita has 60 employees working full-time with a tech team and a policy team. We do a very broad strategy towards this information. That is not necessarily the case everywhere else. If you look at Japan, there are big differences, basically because only one of the fact-checkers that is certified by the International Fact-Checking Network is related to media on its own. The other ones are more NGOs or academia related, and that makes a difference in the way that they approach fact-checking. Not in the quality of fact-checking itself, but I think it's worth taking that into account. Secondly, I'm moving on to fact-checking around the world. I think we also need to understand that fact-checking has grown a lot over the past few years, but it's stopping its growth. And this is significant and has a reason, which is funding. There was a lot of fact-checking or funding for fact-checking in years 2014 onwards. Since 2023, I would say that has started to decline, not necessarily in the European Union, but it has in the rest of the world. Basically because fact-checkers around the world live out of grants and private foundations funding, and in Europe out of EU funding partly, and collaboration with platforms, and we'll get to that in a minute. I think it's worth mentioning here that fact-checkers are not institutions or organizations that appoint themselves as fact-checkers, and therefore they need to be trustworthy. Fact-checkers undergo an annual review done by the International Fact-Checking Network, and in some regions by the regional organizations like the EFCSN, that with an independent assessor will look at them not being partisanship, the transparency of sources, the transparency of funding and organization, a transparency of methodology, and an open and honest corrections policy. Over 170 organizations worldwide are signatories of the International Fact-Checking Network and have been reviewed over that process. This is what I was talking to you before. Most fact-checking organizations are small. So most fact-checking organizations, over 40%, have between 1 and 5 employees. What you see in Spanish fact-checking organizations is not usually the norm. And this means that while fact-checking does a lot towards the fight against disinformation within civil society and also generates a lot of data and evidence around FIMI, but also around DIMI and around the systemic design that enables disinformation to thrive, we're still an unresourced, unresilient ecosystem. I was talking before about where the funding is coming from. So this is the big issue and why the fact-checking environment might shrink in the coming years. We've been funded for the past 5 to 10 years overly by platforms. And platforms are retreating from that funding, but also from any kind of effort to protect citizens from disinformation. This is going to be, it's already an issue for many organizations and for many fact-checkers around the world, and for the impact that fact-checking has, it's going to get worse in the coming years. Let me move. I'm not going to be a very happy panelist today, though. Let me move on to regional initiatives just so that you understand how important these are. The EFCSN, which is the organization that I chair since it was funded, has over 60 members in over 40 countries across the Council of Europe, not only the EU. It is an important organization in the sense that it has enabled fact-checkers to have a unified voice when it comes to lobbying and advocacy within the EU institutions and other countries, also when it comes to defending their members from the harassment that they suffer from governments and others. And more importantly, it has enabled us to coordinate in the kind of work that we do. So all these disinformation campaigns that we've been talking about that have no geographical limits, that tend to have to do with language, but also that travel across regions pretty easily and across languages. This effort, the EFCSN, has enabled us to see how those campaigns get set up live. So we can detect disinformation campaigns that are traveling across the European Union or across European countries and see who are the promoters and who are pushing them and who are spreading them. This kind of work is extremely valuable, not only for fact-checkers themselves that can report on this and then alert the public, but also for institutions that might be looking at how those disinformation campaigns are coordinating. I think it's worth mentioning that in the same way that we understand that foreign interference campaigns are well coordinated with domestic actors, we're also seeing a very good coordination among domestic actors of different countries. And being able to spot that and being able to understand how those groups are getting together and coordinating those efforts, it's extremely important to better understand how that problem can be solved and attacked. I think Beatriz talked about the structures and understanding the financial mechanisms and the structures on how those operate. That is part of what the civil society is helping to build and to give more understanding to. Is there something similar to the EFCSN in the Pacific? I don't think so, not yet, but there is at least the seed that is trying to make this happen. It's called OASIS, the Oceania Asia Society for Information Integrity and Safety, and they literally just became an organization like 3 weeks ago. Their idea is to try to build something similar to the EFCSN to be able to tackle better those efforts and understand how this information is moving across the region. I told you that I wanted to talk about the relationship with legislators within the EU. I think this is worth mentioning specifically because there are several country representatives here, and at some point they might want to engage with OASIS. It's worth understanding that fact-checkers come from a perspective of non-partisanship and independence, and protecting that independence in those relationships is extremely important. I also think it's worth acknowledging that depending on the journalistic culture in each country, that might look different. For journalists within the European Union, relationship with the European Commission or other institutions has been part of how we conduct our work, whereas if you go to the US, an American journalist would never be able to do policy on the side of the reporting that they're doing. I think that looks different in Europe. I have no idea how it looks in Japan, and I'd love to hear more about it. Understanding that in the same way that fact-checkers will collaborate with institutions, they will pressure and do advocacy towards institutions is crucial. Fact-checkers, on a general basis, work on a mission and will try to build upon that mission in different ways. But the mission is the central issue for this. Understanding that this ecosystem is going to need funding in the coming years if it wants to continue to exist everywhere around the world. We are being defunded by the minute, and that is going to create, well, I would say a huge crisis within the sector, but also a lot of organizations will end up closing. And it is worth mentioning that we are evidence providers for enforcement of the law, at least within the European institutions. Many fact-checking organizations are working together with the DSA enforcement team to provide evidence, not only on how disinformation campaigns thrive, but specifically how platform systems enable those disinformation campaigns, and hence they're not fit within the DSA requirements. And last, I would like to mention a couple of things. One is that idea of the great retreat from big platforms. What we're seeing from most of the big tech platforms based in the US is that they are, for two reasons, I would say. One is geopolitical, and one is the AI, and the other one is the AI race. They are defunding any kind of efforts towards user safety, but more importantly, they are changing their systems so that disinformation is no longer a priority for trust and safety teams. And we're seeing that in every platform. I think it's worth understanding also that the changes in consumption are extremely deep right now, and I don't think we have enough data now in March, but we will likely in June, to say that maybe around, this is my guess, and then you can fact check me in a couple of months. I think that 30% of the population is currently consuming their news through AI chatbots. And that means that the mediation of information that used to be done by professional journalists is being done by LLMs. And that also means that the way that we put valuable information out there is changing, is going to change dramatically in the coming months. And we need to think about those strategies as well when we try to approach this problem. I already mentioned this, but I really think it's very important to focus on the issue at hand, at least in Europe. And again, I would love to know more about the Japan situation, which is that domestic information manipulation is huge right now. And I know we talk a lot about the Russians, and I know we talk a lot about the Chinese, and I think we should be talking more about the US, but we really need to focus on domestic information manipulation. And last but not least, I do think that when we talk about this problem, we need to talk about defense. Yes, we need to talk about national security, of course. We need to talk about civil society and education, and that cannot be left apart, because at the end of the funnel, there's a citizen, and that citizen needs to understand what's going on. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Clara, for this very thoughtful presentation. Well, it's great that we have like almost an hour for the conversation. I really like that, frankly speaking. Well, I propose to go like this. Okay, first I have a few questions myself. So I would like to put these questions to the whole panel. I'm afraid that Professor Aoi, you will be burdened a little bit more, since you are the only Japanese speaker, so I'm afraid, that will happen, but sorry for that. And then maybe when you reply, you can also put on the table some things that you think that are relevant, but have not been mentioned yet, or maybe haven't been mentioned enough yet. So I think this would be also useful for triggering the conversation with the audience. We will go in reverse order. So Clara, would you go first? Sorry, you will be last. And then when we finish doing this, we will open, okay, the conversation for all of you, so you can raise your own questions. So, I have a few questions myself, as I said. First, it was mentioned, in different presentations, this idea of disinformation is like a new phenomenon. Yeah, that's my yeah, exactly. I mean, I didn't want to go that far, but yeah. Yeah. Well, really? I mean, it's not that new, right? But probably what is really new is the technological dimension and the challenges associated maybe with this technological dimension. So, and related to that, my question is, do we have in Japan, in Spain, in the EU, are we putting enough resources for facing a challenge that is increasing exponentially due to this fast, neck breaking, technological development? So that's one of my questions. And related to that, do we have enough coordinating instruments among different actors? This also was mentioned before. This is like a multi-dimensional whole of society kind of challenge. So are we doing enough to coordinate different actors, different sectors in our society to face this issue? Another question, maybe more focused to Professor Aoi, because I think it was put on the table. I think we got a clear idea on which are the most common disinformation campaigns that the EU faces. I think it was mentioned, related to Russia, and some examples were given. But maybe, I don't know if Professor Aoi, could you give some more specific example of the typical kind of disinformation, campaign that Japan faces, from FIMI perspective, foreign disinformation, I mean. The third, it was also mentioned that there are some institutional and technological differences between Japan and the EU, for addressing this issue. And maybe I got it wrong, but I think that it was more presented as a potential obstacle for further collaboration. And I wonder if this could be also seen actually as room for collaboration. I mean, since the level of institutional and technological development is not even, maybe we can share some good practices. I mean, can we cooperate or collaborate on trying to get, better institutions and better technology together in order to face this? I'm sorry, but I'm very excited about this topic, so I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity. Also, it was mentioned, that we face dilemmas, right? When approaching this problem, we need to balance different things. For example, like freedom of the press, and addressing disinformation, or these dilemmas. Another dilemma that was mentioned is how do we face foreign disinformation? With this foreign disinformation is provoked not by an adversary government, but by an ally, and we are starting to face this issue. I don't think we need, probably all of you here know, what's been happening today and yesterday. This is change, between the Spanish government and the U.S. government, on this. And also, last question, sorry. What are we doing to tackle the connections between domestic and foreign disinformation? Those connections, how are we tackling them in the EU or in Japan and in Spain? So sorry for being, taking so much time, but I'm really excited about this. So, as I said, maybe shall we go in reverse order? So, Clara, can you go ahead?
Sure. I don't think I have all your questions, but I have the ones that I think I can answer. So you asked about are there enough resources in order to tackle the problem? Let me put it in a different perspective from an EU perspective. I think the way that the European Union, or at least that the European Commission has gone around this information, is we can not go because of a question of freedom of expression against the disinformers themselves. And I think FIMI plays a bit of a different role here, but in general. So we're going to try to do legislation upon platforms and around distribution, right? And that's where the DSA comes in and the code of conduct, which I think has been for now the right approach. Now we just need the law to actually be implemented and enforced. Are there enough resources to enforce the DSA? I don't think so. And there are 350 people working in Brussels around DSA enforcement. And there's a team specifically for DSA enforcement. But a lot of what the DSA is doing and the DSA enforcement team is doing is rely on organizations from civil society, for example, to be able to provide data, examples, and breaches of the law. And if that is the way that you're going to enforce the law, which is okay, it's a choice. I think there's a lot of expertise within civil society to be able to do this kind of thing, and specifically when you're looking at...
I'm sorry, but I'm listening something, in the audience, so please.
And specifically when you're looking at such a diverse ecosystem like the European Union, you need to understand that there has to be some kind of funding towards those CSOs that are actually providing evidence for the enforcement of the law. And maybe that kind of funding does not need to be grants. Maybe that kind of funding needs to be paying for services, like any other organization would do if they need to provide data on a specific topic for a report. That's one thing that I'll say there. On the being there enough coordination among the different institutions, I don't think there is. I think at least within the European Union, there's a plan within the Democracy Shield to try to coordinate all those different groups better. As everything within the European Union, it will likely take a bit of time until we can see it happen. But there is some kind of coordination, of soft coordination, I would say. It's not institutional, but we all work together. We all speak with each other. We sort of know what's going on. How do we face FIMI when done by an ally? So I'm not a geopolitical expert, but we might need to revisit the term ally at this point of the conversation. I will say one thing when we talk about FIMI coming from the US, and I would love to hear more from Beatriz later on this if she can. I think that the kind of foreign interference and disinformation campaigns that we're going to see from the US, that we're seeing, are or very obvious or might start being more related to the technological advantage that they have because they run the platforms in which we communicate, and hence they're going to be more algorithmic and not necessarily content-wise. And that's going to be a huge challenge for the European Union and for every other country to actually be aware that they're happening, have enough proof of them happening, and at some point try to give an alternative that is not necessarily dominated by a different government, I guess. And last but not least, what are we doing to tackle the connections between national disinformers and foreign interference? I can speak to what we are doing. So we have a database of events, actors, and entities, and we track how those actors relate to different events and how they relate to different entities. And that enables us to have a better picture on who is mostly connected to national campaigns that have been pushed by foreign interference and who isn't, and how those connections work, so that we can have a map of how national disinformants work, basically.
Okay, Guillermo?
I was going to start by saying thank you, but you've put a lot of stuff on our plates, and I'm not very thankful for that. So, firstly, obviously, disinformation is not new. There was a wonderful exhibition curated by the late Mario Tascon, which began all the way back with examples from Roman times and how coins were used to disinform. However, there is a way in which we're facing a new threat because of the scale, the cost, the capacity of AI systems, globalization, and so on and so forth. In that respect, it is almost a new phenomenon. Secondly, are there enough resources? Clearly not. Clara gave some examples. I don't know how candid Beatriz would be allowed to be on the matter. I'm sadly not very free to give examples. So take my word for it. I will think about how to allow Clara to fact check me so that you can just take this in face value. There are not enough resources. There are not enough analysts. There isn't enough of a capacity to access and process foreign media, let alone pursue narratives across media, across languages, and so on and so forth. Dealing simply with the open source intelligence aspect of it, we are sorely lacking in capacity. And that's not commensurate with the level of preoccupation that our authorities try, rightly, if I may say so, to raise the level of. I should not dare to speak of typical examples of campaigns against Japan. I have come across some, but I do not know enough to know how representative they may or may not be. As for technical and technological gaps between the EU and Japan and how they might help or hinder cooperation, I will ask for some more time. This is a tricky one, and I should not like to step on it. However, I do have enough familiarity with the remaining 3 questions by my count. There is a dilemma, especially in Europe these days, between freedom of the press and checking and tackling disinformation. And it is quite worrisome to me that the further east one goes in Europe, the more likely one is to welcome restrictions in freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I was recently in Brussels for a series of debates among member states with practitioners coming from Ukraine and other member states. There are also very interesting documents that are easily and openly accessible coming from the hybrid COE in Helsinki, where Ukrainian officials very openly and candidly state, had we known then what we know now, we would have taken Russian media off the communication space years ago. We seriously encourage you to do the same. This is a debate that needs to happen. Hopefully, we will do the right thing and strike the right balance. This is one of the trickiest aspects in this issue. It is very difficult for a democracy to strike that balance. It's just as as difficult for us as is it easy for autocracies and dictatorships and all the kinds of regimes to do as they please and to just outlaw any diverging views and so on and so forth. It is a very, very tricky one, and quite honestly, the future of our Western democracies and Eastern democracies, as the case may be, hangs in the balance. This is one for the history books. You have mentioned allies and their role in FIMI operations. Very diplomatically, you turned a blind eye to the elephant in the room. The elephant being the United States, I believe. I shall endeavor to be just as diplomatic and answer by opening a new area of thought, which is the effect, and this is something that Clara and I have discussed before, the effect that the turnaround in American policy has had on global efforts to counter disinformation. I am not comfortable speaking about the US as a source of disinformation, but the reluctance to even speak about disinformation has played a key role in events in the last few months. When Clara mentioned that platforms were pulling out of funding of fact-checking networks, this is to a large extent due to the messages that they have got from the Trump administration. And they're very happy in the US to say that while they were open to discussions on the issue during the previous administration, and may I remind everyone here that an MOU was signed by Secretary of State Blinken and Foreign Minister Alvarez in 2024, if memory serves, organizing US and Spanish efforts to counter disinformation globally. The Trump administration was very happy to let us know they had second thoughts, and they had come to the realization, and this goes back to the preceding point, that countering disinformation might be a tool to repress freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I will leave it there, otherwise I might overstep my professional boundaries. And finally, how can we tackle the phenomenon that Clara brought up? And she, a few months ago, provided me with a fascinating example that Maldita published, dealing with coordination among Russia, Mexico, and Spain on specific subjects having to do with public morality and public policy. Let me also skirt that one as deftly as I'm able to by tooting my own horn and insisting upon the need that we have to use a linguistic approach when dealing with this. Language played a large role in 2017 when, during events in Catalonia in late 2017, Spain was inundated with narratives and memes and videos and doctored photographs purporting to depict what was going on in Catalonia, and the ability of Russia to rely on the help of Venezuela was a determining factor in what happened all those years ago. So how do we tackle that cooperation between national and international sources of disinformation? There are obviously very many ways to do this, but please do not forget the fact that when we are dealing with global languages, language itself is something to consider. And in the same way as it facilitates coordination, it may have a spillover effect that we also have to take into account. When anti-vax content was aimed at local populations in, let's say, Ecuador, the fact that they share a language with a global community, and the fact that there's a large Ecuadorian diaspora residing in Spain effectively meant that those contents and those efforts aimed at destabilizing a third country had effect on European soil in Spain. If you do not remember enough about that, it should be sufficient to keep in mind the effects that FEMI campaigns, Russian FEMI campaigns targeting South-Saharan countries had an effect on French and Belgian major cities, where people were exposed to the same content by virtue of language. And I think that's at least all the notes I took about your many questions.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. Felix?
Of questions. I see several gaps in regard what we do to counter disinformation and we cannot do. The first question is that on the one hand we have successful models, ways of cooperation. For instance, within the European network, we are getting on board the digital journalists, experts dealing with disinformation from a long time ago, with the new media ecosystem and so forth, and they have been living all the problems about communication in general within this new digital ecosystem. On the other hand, we have, together with this, representatives from the technological community, computing, informational services, technical faculties, and they are trying to apply new technologies to measure, to compare. And finally, and we are the last in coming, those political scientists, sociologists, which are dealing with this new area of knowledge. And in our experience, the level of cooperation is very high. They are increasing the level of understanding of the phenomenon. But the problem comes with they reach the level of knowledge enough to apply all that conceptual, theoretical knowledge to the study of disinformation campaign. And in this area, what we witness is that for technological platforms, it's very difficult to share data. And without those data, it's very difficult to advance our level of knowledge. But not only technological platforms, but also governments are reluctant to provide the fact-checkers, journalists, and technological communities. How do they measure? How do they foresee? How do they fight? And we enter into different worlds. And then there is an increasing gap on resources. Those in charge of disinformation come with much more resources than those who are countering the phenomenon. Why? Because they can focus the disinformation in one single area, moment, and country, where we have to deal with a large scope of potential vulnerabilities, and that makes for them easier and cheaper to concentrate. And together with this, those responsible have no legal, moral, or ethical restriction to apply that technology. And that is something I would want to say we cannot avoid, but perhaps we have to think about how we should overcome this moral restriction that make us fight in different conditions with our enemies. Especially, and this is another gap I say, I believe that the civil community is much more involved or much concerned about disinformation than the governmental elites. Of course, they are interested, but if we approach it from an informational warfare, there is hybrid warfare that belongs to defense. If we talk about disinformation, it's using digital platform, it's cyber defense. And it's a question of election, it's internal security. So we have so many focus on disinformation, and only a small few group of responsible trying to gather all the different dots into a relevant picture. And without that sense of relevance for the governments, disinformation will never be a priority. It's not a priority within the cyber diplomacy, within the disinformation diplomacy. We have not so many strategic communication tools of our opponents, of our Russian, Chinese, and local disinformators. And finally, this is a new area of knowledge, and our academy, our universities are very far away of the state of art. Unless we promote the study, the development of disinformation as a new area of academic expertise, it will be very difficult to find the talent, the required talent to deal with all these new problems. And this is something we are trying to promote or to request from the civil society on our governments. Please take care of the disinformation at all these levels, at academic, at the resources level, and political level.
Thank you, Felix. Professor Ai.
Thank you for the chair for such a long list of questions. I will summarize my answer in a sort of in a form of argument, hopefully. I don't like the term disinformation because I personally find it very difficult to define. It's impossible to define. And as the chair rightly pointed out, the problem is as long as human history. For me, it makes sense to categorize it as subversion, you see, intent to really subvert your ideas, processes. It's a form of interference. It's a broad concept, so it can take any form. So therefore, as a result, it's impossible to actually find enough resources for it. So from public policy standpoint, therefore, it becomes very important to find priorities. I am actually, unfortunately, an expert on national security, international security, and strategic theory. It's quite possible to actually, I tend to therefore focus on foreign interference, how information is part and parcel of our opponent's strategy. So those are the areas that concern me a lot. So somebody asked for, and also I find it kind of interesting to distinguish between uses of, also I footnote, strategic communications, as the way NATO defines now, is a prerogative of democracies. It's something that democracies do. So China and Russia, whoever else, what they do is not STRACOM according to their definition. So it's easier for me to understand what they're trying to do in two categories, whatever it is. One, aimed at confusion. So Russia does this often. They give out 500 different interpretations of, for example, Novichok attacks. That's to confuse. I don't think they really care if it builds up to a certain coherent narrative. If any information also has a very constructive quality, and China actually traditionally relied on this very well, and I think China is a very talented producer of long-term narratives underlined by their actions and currently the huge amount of money. So you see, it becomes then very difficult to say everything China is doing is disinformation, right? So you need a really, really comprehensive approach to actually, and also to do something about it. And also counter disinformation, I think, is a discredited concept by now, because by trying to counter it, you amplify your enemy's narratives. And you don't do anything. What matters is the resonance, how population like it or not. And depending upon the areas, and I don't think that there has been enough research to understand how resonance is explained. Whatever Russia says or China says, it doesn't matter if it's true or lies. What is the standard to understand truth and lies? If it resonates with the local population, then it's a bad news for us, yes? And it has done so in a number of areas. Russian narratives resonate in certain societies. And it doesn't correspond with national borders, which makes the FIMI a very difficult concept, if I may, because nothing can be characterized as purely foreign. So somebody asked for, I'm losing my kind of thought here, choice, but somebody asked, for example, most recent example that I came across, that is a problematic narrative, which Japan probably, if I may suggest respectfully to my government, is to do something about certain interpretation of the current government's policy. As everyone is aware, there is a kind of a dialogue between China and Japan going on about what Prime Minister said about Taiwan in the Diet. I won't get into details about that, but what is really problematic is that whoever said Japan's policy now to strengthen the defense efforts is a militarization. that word or language or narrative, however you call it, that discourse, if it resonates to local population, if there are foreign groups that believe what Japan is doing is re-militarization, then that's a problem for Japan. That's a huge problem. So we better do something about it. And I can tell you that within Europe, there are many people who believe that. If you peek into X, there was a Sky journalist who is repeating Chinese narrative openly. If that's believed, trigger into Western societies, and there are maybe segment of society that doesn't know that much about Japan, then that's a problem. So I think that's not the counter-disinformation problem. That's a strategic communications problem for Japan. So it makes sense for Japan to explain what precisely its defense policies are. right? I mean, if that prompts Chinese kind of argumentation, then let that be. You know, we have to explain what our defense policy is. It's not militarization. It's not aggressive. Actually, there's not that much change since 2014, and that's well in the open. But that needs to be explained to broader public, including key Western audiences. And someone said within Japan, how significant is a problem? Within Japan, I don't think it's really, I mean, no one thinks it's militarization, to take that example. Japan, I think, I was slightly worried in the last upper house election that Japan might be becoming a bit more fragmented and susceptible to, discourses that are almost like a copycat version of Eastern ultra-right or Russian narratives. But in the last lower house election, it was a landslide of the current prime minister. That's very interesting. And that kind of made me, again, being convinced that the Japan's public is actually quite unified on the key tenets over foreign policy and socio-economic policy. I mean, we of course struggle with many aspects, but I don't think there's such a cleavage there. So you see, I don't think we have enough evidence, enough theory to explain vulnerability of a population, or if vulnerability is the right term to describe, the degree of influence that foreign manipulation might have. So I think I said what I had to say. So yeah, I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to open the floor. So please, when you raise a question, first introduce yourself. And we are going to take a few of them, okay, before replying. So please go ahead.
Sí, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I'm Manuel Acerete. I'm a diplomat. I think from what I heard that probably the best way against disinformation, FIMI and so on, is the independent fact-checking. And maybe the best thing that governments can do, organizations that you can do, is to provide the independent fact-checkers who have the credibility the information they need to debunk the FIMI, to debunk the disinformation, to put right the checks. But what other methods are there? Even if this is the best one, can we explore other things? Some have been, I think, mentioned. It's maybe a broader international cooperation against the insularity, because it was very interesting what Guillermo López said regarding these spaces, linguistic and cultural spaces, which have their own, let's say, tendencies and their own opportunities to debunk disinformation. But at the same time, with new technologies, maybe the linguistic spaces are more diffuse. It's automatic translation, artificial intelligence. You can read the same thing in Japan and in Andalusia. So maybe what we need is broader international cooperation for even broader international fact-checking and sometimes debunking disinformation on Spain is better if that comes from not just Venezuela, but could be in a weird fashion, but from Japan or from England or whatever. No? Another method, sanctions, are a tool in the hybrid toolbox and in the disinformation toolbox. It's already been used against Russia to a certain extent. But of course, the balance between that instrument and, well, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, offensive methods, Felix Arteaga mentioned that. Of course, if we do in the offensive strategic operations,
sorry,
could that be
just one moment. Don't copy myself. Don't copy myself.
No,
sorry. Just in the sense that I raised too many questions, so we don't have much time. That's what I meant. Sorry, please.
Alternative methods, even maybe rules for artificial intelligence. They need to quote the sources of what is stated there, whatever.
Thank you, Ramon Pacheco. I'm part of the Scientific Council of Elcano. A quick question, actually. The title of the seminar is about EU-Japan cooperation. So if the panelists can give some examples of practical cooperation between the two sides and maybe other like-minded partners, Australia, Canada, Korea, for example, as well? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm Janno Pajo from the Estonian Embassy. Thank you so much for the interesting event and the panel. I have a couple of questions, I think, to Clara, maybe Professor Aoi as well, and if to the Commission as well, if possible. Clara mentioned the reducing of the financing. Maybe I missed it, but what might be the reasons for that, and does the Commission agree with that? Then secondly, is there a similar network in the United States as in Europe, or has it just had like the same fate as USAID in the United States, that actually no funding at all anymore? And finally, you mentioned, Clara, the AI threats or the challenges. Basically, my question is to you and maybe Professor Aoi, that whether AI actually is a tool for fact checkers as well, or not. Thanks.
Okay, now I propose that going back to the panel, please try to be quick in your replies so we can maybe open one more round of questions. Felix, you go first now.
We are still attached to the old security order, and we try to respond to new security challenges in old traditional ways. We are at the Institute dealing with this gap between reality and moral war. For instance, with cybersecurity, both our governmental and private actors are receiving cyber attacks day after day. The number of attacks is huge, and we are still attached to a defensive posture. We have to defend, we have to prevent, we have to invest a lot of money. But the question is that our private firms, our individuals, are not going to be cyber attacked or disinformated by the fact of being individuals or private, but because they belong to a specific country. And we are in a geopolitical war where everything that the enemy, Russia, China, could do against private individuals, companies, political parties will affect the government. And that brings back the question. The government nowadays is the governments have the monopoly of the defense of the offensive weapons, of the offensive postures. But unless they react in an offensive way, the civil and society and the governments and institutions will not be defended any longer, because they have to be more proactive. I'm not saying that everything will have to be militarized and the anti-disinformation measure will have to be militarized. But we can be more active. At least if you can read the last preparedness strategies of the European Union, the tone, the wording is open to new words like offensive posture, offensive measures, and that is something we have to take into account. Not only for the sake of attacking the enemy, but for the sake of deterring the enemy, because for the time being we have no clear answer. For instance, how we can admit that the Western European community, the Western society, is not able to influence the Russian public opinion about the casualties in Ukraine, about the loss of economic and social welfare, the societies, and the difficulties that the President Putin and the Russian armed forces face in Ukraine. We are not able to influence, and how we are still trying to prevent that the narrative, the Russian narrative, infect our civil and governmental thinking. I mean, we need to be more proactive. That is better. A good deterrent is better than a well-articulated defense forever. That I will stop here. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. Quickly, I didn't get all the questions. Well, collaboration among like-minded countries. I think it's it would be best if we could have something more multilateral than bilateral. EU something that encompasses Indo-Pacific region. But again, it will be really depending upon case by case, because FIMI or foreign interference, often viewing from the local society, is inevitably intertwined with their own domestic political dynamics. So it's going to be very difficult to a priori delineate on such and such cases, we will do this and that. I think that's a reality. So case by case, of course, we remain in dialogue. We keep updated each other's situations. We share analysis. I think those are really realistic kind of things to agree upon. But then to move from that to operational kind of responses, I think that would have to be probably case by case, I think. But I think there are a number of areas where like-minded countries could do together. I think on top of my list is, as I explained, is to actually share information, do common research projects, and also terminology, because there's a huge variation in terminology. On the impact of AI, I think it can be used in any way. So it can be used to do fact check, but it can be used for a number of malign purposes. There is an interesting report published by NATO Stracom COE called Next Generation Information Environment. So it's worth taking a look at it. That tries to analyze the impact of AI on the information environment. And I will not, go any further into that today.
So first of all, I think it's worth mentioning this. I don't think fact-checking is the best response to this information. I do think we are the front line of this information, and hence we're the first ones that are seeing it and the first ones that are trying to map it out. That said, what I do think is that the information that fact-checkers gather and enrich and have done so over time is extremely valuable for other stakeholders to tackle the problem. You mentioned other plausible solutions. I do think, nonetheless, that despite automatic translation, the linguistic side of it is extremely important, because it's not only linguistic, it's also social and behavioral. And I think that's what makes the difference for Spanish in 3 continents, to be a clear silk route for disinformation in Spanish, whereas you don't necessarily see that in other languages that are shared among different countries. I think it's worth mentioning that technology is gonna help us in this. I do think that if we're able to put together all the data and knowledge that different stakeholders have around this topic and to collaborate, technology is going to enable that cooperation, but it's also going to scale that cooperation to the size of the disinformative problem. Nonetheless, and you said fact-checking is the best solution, but which are the others? I think there are 2 solutions that are basic here. One is legislation that is applied and enforced. The other one is understanding that there are different stakeholders within the problem that are causing different parts of it, and that legislation has to address them all. So we have platforms for distribution. We sure need to look at some kind of legislation towards organized disinformation and towards economic gain for disinformation creation. And we also need to understand that as citizens we are responsible, that politicians are responsible. Big part of the disinformation problem here. And then I want to mention one last thing, because you talked about offensive methods, and one of the things that I'm starting to hear and that I'm quite concerned about is this idea that if they are playing with this set of rules, well, let's just all play with that set of rules. To me, that is like, if we buy into that discourse, that's the end of it. We'll see a change in systems, we'll stop having parliamentary democracies across Europe, and then let's see where it goes. But I think that's a huge risk at the current moment. Practical cooperation. So one of the things that the fact-checking world knows about is about this cooperation, because we do it whenever there are global crises. And we've seen that, for example, when the Ukraine invasion started, we set up a thing that was called Ukraine Facts, in which we compiled all the different disinformation that we were seeing across the world. And that enabled us to actually identify where the different disinformation campaigns were being targeted in different regions. So that was an interesting exercise of how that practical cooperation can actually work. And then to the representative of the Estonian embassy, reduction in finance. Well, I think there are several reasons for which this has happened. We need to understand that because many of us are NGOs and nonprofits, there was a part of our budgets that came from US aid. And that was the first strike. This pull out of platforms comes also in terms of funding. There are cooperation programs like the third-party fact-checking with Meta that still happen everywhere but the US. They're likely to end at some point. I would say sooner than later. But also there were other types of cooperation programs and grants that came from platforms that disappeared. For example, Google put 30 million only in disinformation 2 years ago, and they're putting 0 this year. That's only in Europe. Like that's an easy go example. Secondly, most of the fact-checking organizations in Europe, but in many places across the world, were funded not only with the support of USAID, but also with the support of US-based philanthropy, private philanthropy. And when Trump came into office, that started to disappear as well, because there was some kind of fear within the US philanthropy to continue to fund these kinds of efforts. They are starting slightly to come back because of the midterms, but we don't know how intensive that's going to be. And thirdly, there is EU funding, but that's it does not fill the gap, I would say. Then you asked about similar network in the US. So I think that the equivalent to the EFCSN, but it's actually a broader organization, would be the International Fact-Checking Standards Network. Is based in Poynter Institute, which is based in St. Petersburg, Florida. It is, yeah, it's kind of funny, but it is the network that combines all the fact-checkers across the world. It came before the EFCSN, and the regional networks just started to appear because we needed closer organizations to the regions that were not that broad and that big. And then you ask about AI as a tool at the service of fact-checking. So I think AI can help fact-checkers, and it can actually help a lot to understand better how the disinformation ecosystem is working. So to extract narratives, to identify actors, to combine the knowledge from the different fact-checkers. Right now, especially after this week, to say that AI is gonna fact-check, I think it's too soon. We've seen what's happened with not only Grok, but also the AI overview of Google with images from Iran's attack. I don't think we're there yet. I do think it is a tool that can help, and it's certainly a tool that we use on a daily basis.
Guillermo, very brief, please.
I will take up a few of the general questions since others had specific addressees. As to other means of combating disinformation, we'll mention a couple. You mentioned sanctions. Obviously, that's an obvious but tricky one. It goes back again to restricting freedom of speech, so not a politically easy one. We are seeing the emergence in Europe of a system of sanctions that works outside the purview of the courts, and that's a strategic risk that we are taking. We are letting public officials make decisions that courts ought to be making. But then there are specific ideas such as pre-bunking. I think the wider consensus is that the best tool against disinformation works in the long term, and it's providing media literacy and education. And we have to be aware how deep the roots of this problem go, in that it's not a methodology, or it's not a fight amongst facts. The very notion of truth has been swept away in the last few years. We have become overly familiar with notions such as post-truth or alternative facts. These concepts and narratives all have contributed to doing away with the very notion that there is such a thing as the truth. And we need an educational effort to reinstate the belief of our citizens in the concept of truth, in the idea that there are such a thing as facts that ought not to be disputed. That's, I think, a long-term solution. We need a barrage of short and medium-term solutions that have been mentioned. As to understanding the potential of AI to help tackle disinformation, I want to muddy the waters by alluding to the potential of AI to worsen the problem. There have been very interesting reports coming from NewsGuard in the United States and from the hybrid COE in Helsinki that have suggested, if not proven, that corpora and LLMs have been poisoned with bad data. And there is a difference let me provide an example. NewsGuard every month runs the 10 most widespread rumors and narratives and pieces of disinformation across the world. And so they run these narratives against the 10 most important chatbots and LLMs, and the results are very, very discouraging. If we compare languages, it is even worse. France has more or less managed to protect French from these threats and from data poisoning and data grooming. It still faces bad results about 30% of the time. So if you ask, I don't know what the topmost fake news is, let's say Khamenei is not dead, 30% of the time for French, going up to 50% of the time for Russian, Chinese, and very close to that for Spanish, mind you, it will tell you that actually is the truth. So there's the potential, and Clara has mentioned it, and there are wonderful examples of things being done with AI, but we are not the only ones looking at it and its potential in this field. The bad guys are doing it too, and they're being pretty darn successful about it. And finally, about offensive capabilities, it all goes back to what we allow ourselves to do in the defense of our system, our democratic system. Because there's a very fine line between strategic communication and putting fake news out there. And that is one that I believe we should not cross. There's a very interesting report out of the Foreign and Defense Ministries of France from 2018 or something like that, which considers how to potentially go about being more offensive in the cognitive domain. And they're very adamant that that France, and I think this is true for Spain as well, we ought to be putting more of our message out there. We ought to be more efficient out there, but we ought to only tell the truth. Otherwise, we have lost. Because one of the goals of hybrid threats and disinformation and phishing campaigns is to weaken the cohesion of our societies and weaken the image of democracy across the world. If we step down, and as I think you said, if we do what they are doing, and we know very well who they are, then in the long run, we lose the war because we have compromised our principles. We have we have ceded the moral high ground, and we have weakened our democracies in the process. And in the end of that process, all that we create is the possibility for autocratic governments to say, see, we've been telling you all along, they're no different from us. They lie too. And that is a problem. So that's a consideration we have to keep foremost in our minds when discussing offensive capabilities, which by all means we should think about and discuss and even have eventually. But let's not lose track of the bigger game going on here. Thank you.
Okay, Beatriz, I know that but we are really out of time, no?
Yeah, I can.
Actually, I prefer not, but okay, thank you so much. Yeah, because now we need to be somewhere else. So. Okay, so thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our speakers, for the great job they did today. Thank you.